The moment James Varos stepped onto the sterile floor of the Zeranth research facility, every alien scientist in the room turned their elongated heads toward him. Their pale, translucent skin shimmered under the artificial lighting, their compound eyes blinking in rapid succession. James exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance as the Zeranthian head researcher, Valmen, approached him. "We are honored by your presence," human James Valmen said in his species' fluid yet clipped manner. "You are the first of your kind to enter our medical research sector. We wish to study your biological responses in a controlled setting." James nodded. The United Earth Coalition had warned him about the Zeranthians' scientific curiosity. They were logical, meticulous, and deeply fascinated by the physiology of other species, but they lacked any real comprehension of the concept of pain tolerance. Zeranthians, like many advanced species in the galactic community, had long since eliminated suffering through bioengineering. Their nervous systems were designed to limit discomfort, and their medical technology had advanced to the point that even minor pain was an archaic notion to them. Humans, on the other hand, had evolved in a far less forgiving manner. "We have heard reports of your species' resilience," Valmen continued. "However, our models indicate your biology is comparatively fragile. We seek to understand the contradictions in the data." James rubbed the back of his neck. "So what exactly do you want me to do?" "We will conduct a series of harmless tests, beginning with controlled stimulus assessments. This will allow us to measure your biological responses with precision." James had no idea what that meant, but he had agreed to this assignment knowing full well it would involve some discomfort. The UEC wanted better diplomatic relations with the Zeranthians, and if proving humanity's physical resilience was part of that, then so be it. A metallic table extended from the floor, and Valmen gestured toward it. James climbed on, lying flat as mechanical arms folded around his limbs, securing him gently. Dozens of Zeranthians observed from behind a reinforced glass partition, their gaze unreadable. "We will begin with minor dermal stimulation," Valmen said. A robotic appendage descended, pressing a cold instrument against James's forearm. A brief electric pulse followed. He barely felt it. "No reaction," one of the Zeranthians murmured. "Increase voltage," Valmen instructed. The electric pulse intensified. James felt a slight tingle, not unlike static shock, but he remained still. "Still no reaction," another scientist noted. "Increase further." The shocks grew stronger, and James felt his muscles twitch involuntarily. Still, he made no sound. At this point, it was barely more annoying than a malfunctioning hotel keycard zap. The Zeranthians exchanged puzzled glances. "We have reached the upper limits of our usual pain tolerance assessments," Valmen said. "This level of stimulation would cause most species extreme distress." "Yeah. It's not that bad," James said. Silence fell over the room. The Zeranthians whispered among themselves before Valmen gestured for the machine to retract. "Perhaps a different approach," he mused. The next series of tests involved physical impact assessments. Small robotic hammers delivered measured strikes to his limbs, gradually increasing in force. The Zeranthians watched with growing confusion as James barely reacted to blows that would have shattered a Zeranthian's fragile frame. "How are you not exhibiting distress?" one of them finally asked. James rolled his shoulders. This is nothing." Valmen's expression was unreadable. "Your musculoskeletal structure is only marginally denser than ours. By all logic, you should be incapacitated by now." "Maybe logic doesn't apply to humans the way you think it does," James said. The tests continued. The Zeranthians exposed him to extreme temperatures, monitoring his reactions. Ice-cold mist rolled over his skin, then searing heat followed, but he endured both without much issue. They pricked his skin with controlled punctures, monitoring his nervous system's response. He barely winced. The longer the tests went on, the more the Zeranthians whispered among themselves. Confusion gave way to something else, something bordering on disbelief. Finally, Valmen approached again. "Human James, we must inquire further. What is your species' threshold for pain?" James chuckled dryly. "You'd be surprised." Valmen gestured toward another scientist, who brought forth a medical instrument that looked significantly more ominous. "We have one final test. a controlled incision. If your species possesses a nervous system similar to ours, this should provide clear data on your pain responses. James eyed the instrument. You want to cut me? Only a minor incision, Valman clarified. Under controlled medical supervision, your safety is assured. James sighed. Fine, do it. The incision was made. It wasn't deep, but the Zeranthians expected an immediate, visceral reaction. James merely clenched his jaw, watching as the thin cut appeared along his forearm. The Zeranthians collectively froze. You're still conscious, one of them stammered. James exhaled through his nose. This is nothing compared to getting thrown through a windshield or breaking a rib. Hell, I once sprained my ankle and still had to walk 3 miles back to camp. The Zeranthians looked horrified. You walked. On an injured limb. James frowned. Well, yeah, had to. Valman's fingers twitched in what was likely a Zeranthian gesture of unease. Your species. You endure injury while still functioning. Of course. What else would we do? The silence that followed was thick with realization. The Zeranthians had approached this experiment with the assumption that humans were biologically fragile. Now that belief was being torn apart in front of them. Valman turned to his colleagues. We must reevaluate our models immediately. James glanced at his arm, watching as the Zeranthians hastily applied a healing salve to the incision. He could see the unease in their body language. Whatever they had thought about humans before, that perception had just changed dramatically. And this was only the beginning. The Zeranthians didn't stop their experiments after the initial shock. If anything, their curiosity intensified. James wasn't sure whether that was a good or bad thing, but either way, he was stuck in the middle of it. We require further observations of human resilience, Valman had stated the morning after their first tests. James, still shaking off the last remnants of sleep, had only grunted in response. The healing salve had sealed the small cut on his arm within hours, leaving no trace of the incision. He figured the Zeranthians weren't used to seeing something like that either. They had advanced regeneration technology, sure, but their bodies weren't designed to heal naturally from wounds. They lacked scars. They lacked the understanding of what it meant to break and rebuild. And that apparently fascinated them. The next phase of testing involved endurance trials. We have observed that your species is capable of extended physical exertion beyond logical limits, Valman explained as they led James into a controlled environmental chamber. We wish to understand the biological mechanisms behind this phenomenon. James raised an eyebrow. You want me to run, don't you? Yes. So he ran. At first, it was just a light jog on a treadmill-like platform, but the Zeranthians weren't satisfied. They increased the difficulty, adjusting the incline, reducing the oxygen levels, and even altering the gravity. James adapted. He kept going, sweat rolling down his back, heart hammering in his chest, but he pushed through. At some point, he lost track of time. When Valman finally signaled the test's conclusion, James stepped off the platform, legs burning but still steady. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve, exhaling. How long was that, he asked. Valman hesitated. 3 hours. James blinked. That's it. The Zeranthians exchanged glances. You are unimpressed. James shrugged. I mean, humans have run longer. Some people do marathons for fun. Fun, one of the Zeranthian scientists echoed, their voice full of disbelief. Valman's mandibles twitched. This is beyond our understanding. No other species in the galactic community engages in strenuous activity voluntarily. James couldn't help but smirk. Well, that explains a lot. The Zeranthians weren't finished with him yet. After endurance, they moved on to temperature stress. James found himself submerged in freezing water, his skin prickling as the cold seeped into his bones. The Zeranthians watched expectantly, waiting for him to exhibit signs of distress. He clenched his jaw, exhaled, and endured. Next, they exposed him to intense heat, simulating desert-like conditions. Sweat dripped from his brow, his skin flushed red, but still he held firm. The murmuring among the scientists grew louder. This is beyond what our models predicted, one of them said. It is illogical, another added. His biological composition is not significantly different from other carbon-based species, yet he persists. Valmont studied James with what could only be described as fascination. "We do not understand," he admitted. "Your body should have succumbed to stress long before now." James rolled his shoulders. "Humans adapt. We expected adaptability. We did not expect this." By the time they moved on to pain resistance trials again, James wasn't even surprised. This time, they used controlled pressure, testing how much force he could withstand before showing signs of pain. James gritted his teeth and bore it. The Zeranthians watched, their disbelief growing with each passing moment. Finally, Valmont spoke. "Human James, we must ask. Does your species feel pain as others do?" James gave him a tired look. "Of course we do. But you do not react as others do." James exhaled, flexing his fingers. "Pain is complicated. We feel it. We just don't always show it. Sometimes you don't have a choice but to keep going, even when it hurts." Valmont's compound eyes narrowed. "That is not logical." James smirked. "No, but it's human." The Zeranthians fell into thoughtful silence. Whatever preconceived notions they had about humanity had been shattered. And James had the distinct feeling that this was only the beginning. James sat on the examination table, rolling his stiff shoulder, while the Zeranthians debated among themselves. They had thrown nearly every physical test at him, yet he was still here, still functioning, still conscious. They were beginning to look at him differently now. Before, there had been curiosity clinical, detached, the kind that came from studying a fragile organism under a microscope. Now there was something else, a careful distance, a quiet unease. James recognized it for what it was. They weren't just fascinated anymore. They were unnerved. "We must assess psychological pain tolerance," Valmont announced at last, his voice measured. James frowned. "Psychological." Valmont clasped his thin fingers together. "Physical endurance is remarkable, yes, but our research suggests that many species succumb not just to bodily damage but to mental distress. If human physiology is anomalous, we must determine whether the mind follows the same pattern." James hesitated. "And how exactly do you plan to test that?" The lights dimmed. A low hum filled the room as a new set of machines came online. Transparent panels descended from the ceiling, creating an enclosed chamber around him. He noticed faint flickers of movement beyond the glass shadows, shifting, stretching. "These are simulated distress environments," Valmont explained, "designed to evoke extreme psychological discomfort without actual harm." James raised an eyebrow. "Torture chamber, got it." Valmont tilted his head. "Not torture. Observation. We will expose you to various scenarios that induce distress in other species. We wish to see your reactions." James exhaled. "Fine. Do your worst." The first simulation began. At first, it was nothing alarming, just an eerie silence, an unnatural void of sound. Then came the subtle shifts. The temperature dropped. The shadows thickened. Figures began to appear distorted, inhuman things, barely visible at the edge of his vision. Classic psychological warfare. Isolation. Fear triggers. Primal unease. James waited for something worse. The shadows grew bolder, pressing against the glass, whispering in voices that weren't there. The walls closed in slightly. His own reflection distorted, shifting into something unrecognizable. The Zeranthians watched his vitals closely. His heart rate remained steady. The shadows loomed. The whispers became screams. The glass flexed as if it would shatter. James exhaled slowly and closed his eyes. It wasn't real. They were trying to tap into fear, but they didn't understand humans as well as they thought. He had seen real nightmares before, friends bleeding out, sleepless nights in freezing cold, the hollow silence of waiting for bad news. This was a cheap trick. The simulation ended abruptly. The glass panels withdrew, and the lights returned to normal. The Zeranthians were utterly silent. "You did not react," Valmont said finally. James shrugged. That was supposed to scare me. Valman's mandibles twitched. Most species experience extreme distress. Many attempt to flee or collapse from psychological overload. James rolled his shoulders. We have horror movies scarier than that. The room was silent. You voluntarily seek out fear-inducing media, one of the scientists asked hesitantly. Yeah, for entertainment. The murmurs returned, more frantic this time. Valman took a slow step forward. Does your species not break under psychological strain? James's jaw tightened slightly. We do, he admitted. But we get back up. The Zeranthians had no response. They ran more simulations, more psychological trials, more scenarios designed to break him down: isolation, sudden loss, imminent doom, each one a carefully crafted nightmare meant to push the limits of his mind. James endured them all. He could feel their discomfort growing. By the time the final test ended, Valman's movements had become almost hesitant. The certainty in his voice had faltered. Human James, he said carefully, your species, it is not merely resilient, it is something else. James exhaled. We're survivors? Valman's compound eyes narrowed. Survivors at any cost. James didn't respond. The Zeranthians weren't looking at him like a test subject anymore. They were looking at him like something they didn't quite understand. Like something they might never understand. James could feel the shift in the air. The Zeranthians were no longer just curious. They were wary. Their clinical detachment had eroded. The murmurs had changed. The way they moved around him had changed. They had spent days breaking him down, pushing him, testing the limits of human endurance. And now, standing before him in their pristine research facility, they were forced to confront something they had never truly considered. Humans did not break the way other species did. They had spent generations eliminating pain from their existence, reshaping their biology to remove suffering, distress, and fear. And here stood James, an organism that had evolved not just to endure pain, but to function in spite of it. Valman, or their lead scientist, was silent for a long time before finally speaking. Human James, I have reviewed all collected data, he said slowly. I find myself at an impasse. James arched an eyebrow. Oh. Valman clasped his fingers together. Your species defies conventional biological models. Your bodies should be fragile, yet they persist. Your minds should falter under strain, yet they endure. You process pain, yet you do not yield to it as others do. James didn't respond. He just waited. Valman's compound eyes flickered. This is deeply concerning. James tilted his head slightly. Why? Valman hesitated. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, he said, because it means your species is capable of surviving conditions that should not be survivable. And that is unnatural. The room was silent. James exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders. Unnatural, he repeated. No, just different. Valman's mandibles twitched. Different in ways that defy reason. James could see it now, the undercurrent of discomfort, the way the other Zeranthians subtly shifted away from him. It wasn't just scientific curiosity anymore. It was something else. They had assumed humans were fragile. That assumption had been shattered. And now they weren't sure whether that was a good thing. Valman studied him carefully. You do not fear pain as others do. We do, James corrected. We just don't let it stop us. Another silence. James finally sighed and leaned back slightly. Look, I get it, he said. You thought we were weak. That's fine. But pain tolerance doesn't make us invincible. It just makes us stubborn. Valman's gaze didn't waver. Stubbornness is dangerous. James let out a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, it is. The Zeranthians exchanged glances. They weren't used to this. They weren't used to a species that could function beyond its limits. James stood up from the examination table, flexing his fingers. So, what now? Valman hesitated. Then finally he straightened. You are free to leave. We have learned all we need to. James studied him for a moment. And what did you learn? Valmond's expression was unreadable. That humans are not what we thought they were. James exhaled and gave a small nod. Good, you're catching on. The Zeranthians didn't stop him as he left the facility. They simply watched, their unreadable eyes following him as he stepped through the doors and into the waiting transport. As the ship lifted off, James knew one thing for certain. The galaxy would never look at humans the same way again.